There is one practice in Neville Goddard's entire body of work that he returned to with more consistency and more urgency than any other. Not the revision technique, not the scripting of desired scenes, not the affirmations or the ladder experiment or any of the other practices that have been extracted from his lectures and presented as the core of his method. One practice. A practice so simple that most people who encounter it dismiss it as insufficient for the magnitude of transformation they are trying to produce. A practice so structurally specific that doing it approximately rather than precisely produces almost no result. And a practice so mechanically different from everything else the manifestation industry teaches that understanding why it actually works requires dismantling several assumptions about how the subconscious processes information that most people have accepted as true without examining them. Neville called it sleeping in the end, not as a metaphor for accepting that the desired outcome will eventually arrive. As a literal instruction about the specific quality of consciousness you must occupy at the specific neurological moment when the subconscious is most permeable to genuine architectural update. The instruction is not complicated. The execution is extraordinarily difficult, and the difficulty is entirely located in understanding what sleeping in the end actually requires, which is something categorically different from what the phrase sounds like it requires when encountered without the mechanical context that makes it intelligible. Most people who hear the instruction to sleep in the end interpret it as an instruction to visualize the desired outcome while falling asleep. They construct a mental scene of having what they want. They try to hold the scene with as much emotional vividness as possible as consciousness fades toward sleep. They aim to maintain the visualization until sleep takes over, carrying the positive imagery into the unconscious processing of the night. This interpretation is natural. It is logical given what the manifestation industry has taught about the role of visualization, and it is not what Neville was prescribing. It is close enough to feel like the right interpretation and different enough in its actual mechanics to produce fundamentally different neurological results. Neville was not prescribing a visualization practice conducted in the hypnagogic state. He was prescribing the inhabitation of a specific identity in the hypnagogic state. The distinction is the same one that separates all of Neville's actual teaching from the visualization-based methods that have been attributed to him. Visualization constructs a scene and observes it. Identity inhabitation occupies a state and looks out from within it. In the hypnagogic state specifically, the difference between these two approaches is neurologically decisive, because the hypnagogic state is the moment in the daily cycle of human consciousness when the filtering systems that protect the existing baseline from unauthorized update are most fully withdrawn, and what passes through those withdrawn filters in that specific state reaches the subconscious with an authority that no waking practice can match. To understand why the hypnagogic state has this specific property, you need to understand what those filtering systems actually do during ordinary waking consciousness. Throughout the waking day, your nervous system is continuously receiving enormous quantities of information from the environment and from internal physiological processes. The vast majority of this information is irrelevant to the core prediction model that governs your automatic behavior and your automatic emotional responses. The filtering systems identify what is relevant and route it appropriately. Information that confirms the existing baseline gets integrated as expected and unremarkable. Information that deviates from the existing baseline gets flagged for conscious evaluation. Information that arrives through channels. The filtering systems classify as imagination, including visualization, gets routed to the imagination processing network rather than to the prediction model update network, because the filtering systems have correctly identified it as imagination rather than genuine environmental data. This routing is automatic, and it is accurate. The filtering systems are extraordinarily good at their job. They have been calibrated through years of experience to distinguish genuine environmental data from imagination, and they do not make systematic errors in this distinction, regardless of how emotionally intense or subjectively convincing the imagination experience is. The entire problem with visualization as a method for producing permanent subconscious change is that the filtering systems correctly identify it as imagination and route it accordingly every time, regardless of the visualizer's conviction that this time the visualization is truly real and truly felt, and truly connected to the desired outcome. The accuracy of the filtering systems is not a function of the visualizer's sincerity. It is a function of the structural characteristics of how the information arrives. And visualization always arrives through the imagination channels because it is always consciously constructed and known by the constructor to be constructed. The hypnagogic state is the single period in the daily cycle when the filtering systems are not fully operational. They are withdrawing as consciousness transitions from waking to sleep. The evaluation processes that normally route imagination to the imagination network and flag genuine data for conscious review are stepping back from their posts. The subconscious is transitioning from receiving filtered and categorized information to processing the accumulated data of the day through consolidation and the deeper processing modes of sleep. In this transition, information can reach the subconscious prediction model through channels that are ordinarily blocked to it, not because the subconscious becomes credulous or less intelligent, but because the active filtering systems that maintain the distinction between genuine data and imagination are temporarily offline. What this means practically is that the identity you inhabit in the hypnagogic state, the quality of consciousness you are occupying as the conscious directing mind, releases its authority and the automatic systems take over, reaches the subconscious prediction model with a degree of authority that waking practices cannot achieve. It reaches it through channels that are not available during waking visualization because the filtering systems are not there to redirect it. If the identity you are inhabiting in that state carries the structural characteristics of genuine present tense experience, rather than the structural characteristics of consciously constructed imagination, the subconscious receives it as genuine identity data. It does not evaluate whether that identity is currently accurate according to the existing baseline. The filtering systems that would perform that evaluation are offline. It simply receives the data and begins incorporating it into the architecture. This is the mechanical reason why Neville returned to this specific practice with such insistence and urgency throughout his career. It is not the only practice he taught, but it is the practice with the most direct access to the subconscious prediction model without the filtering that makes all other approaches less efficient. Every other practice he described, revision, the living as if throughout the day, the construction of imaginal scenes, all of these are valuable and contribute to the cumulative shift in the neurological baseline, but none of them have the same degree of direct access to the prediction model that the hypnagogic practice has, because none of them occur at the moment when the filtering systems are withdrawn. The practical question is, what sleeping in the end actually feels like and how you know whether you are doing it correctly. Because the instruction to inhabit a specific identity in the hypnagogic state is abstract, and abstract instructions do not reliably translate into concrete practice without some experiential reference for what the correct execution actually feels like from the inside. The most important thing to understand about the correct execution is that it does not feel like doing anything. This is the feature of the practice that makes it most difficult to assess and most difficult to sustain, because the human tendency when trying to produce an important outcome is to apply effort, and the application of effort generates the experience of doing something which generates the feedback that something productive is happening. The hypnagogic practice done correctly generates no such feedback. It does not feel like effort. It does not feel like practice. It does not feel like anything in particular, because what you are attempting to inhabit is a state that does not feel like anything in particular to the person who genuinely inhabits it. Extreme wealth as a genuine neurological baseline generates no more interesting internal experience than the continuing presence of your hands. It is simply there. The person for whom it is simply there does not experience inhabiting it as an achievement or an effort or a practice. They experience it as nothing because it is the baseline. The instruction is to bring that quality of nothing into the hypnagogic state, not a rich and emotionally vivid imaginal scene of what being wealthy looks and feels like, not an affirmation repeated with conviction, not a visualization of a desired bank balance or a desired lifestyle. The specific quality of unremarkable ordinariness that characterizes the experience of someone for whom the desired financial state is simply and completely the case, without interest and without effort and without any conscious attention to its presence, the same way you inhabit the continued presence of your hands, without conscious attention to the fact that your hands are there. This quality is genuinely difficult to access deliberately because it is by definition the absence of deliberate access. You cannot try to feel unremarkable about something. The trying is itself the marker of remarkability. What you can do is approach the hypnagogic state with as little conscious direction as possible. Allow the directing mind to release its authority without constructing anything in the space that authority occupied, and let whatever quality of consciousness remains when the directing mind has stepped back be as close as possible to the quality of someone who is simply, boringly, and permanently wealthy, not hoping to be, not imagining being, simply being, in the completely uninteresting way that you are simply whatever you actually are right now, without effort and without conscious maintenance. The nights when this practice works are almost never distinguishable from the nights when it does not work by any conscious experience during the practice itself. You cannot tell from inside the hypnagogic state whether the filtering systems are sufficiently withdrawn that what you are inhabiting is reaching the prediction model with genuine update authority. You cannot feel the incorporation occurring. The process is completely silent from the perspective of conscious experience. What you can observe over weeks of consistent practice is the gradual shift in the automatic baseline that becomes perceptible when you notice that your nervous system's default response to financial information is slightly different than it was a month ago. Slightly less automatic, slightly less urgent, carrying slightly less of the immediate physiological weight of genuine threat. The shift is small and cumulative, and it does not feel like the result of anything you did, because the process through which it occurred was below the threshold of conscious experience throughout its entire duration. Before the second half of this discussion, check the pinned comment below this video. It contains something specific for the practical implementation of what Neville was describing with this practice. If you have tried sleeping in the end before and found that the instruction felt too abstract to execute reliably, what is in that comment addresses the abstraction directly. The consistency requirement for this practice is the most demanding aspect of it, and it is the aspect that most people underestimate when they begin. A single night of sleeping in the end produces no measurable effect on the subconscious prediction model. 10 nights produce a barely perceptible effect. 30 nights produce a genuine but subtle shift. 90 nights produce a shift that is visible from the outside in the changed automatic responses to financial information that begin showing up in daily behavior without conscious intention. The subconscious does not update its prediction model based on single data points. It updates based on patterns of accumulated data. The hypnagogic practice is building a pattern, one night at a time, of identity data reaching the prediction model through channels that have maximum update authority. The pattern requires time to accumulate into a genuine architectural shift, and the time required is not a function of how intensely or how skillfully the practice is executed on any individual night. It is a function of how consistently it is executed across nights, regardless of how any individual night feels from the inside. This is the point at which most people's engagement with the practice breaks down, and it breaks down in a specific and predictable way. They execute the practice consistently for 2 or 3 weeks. They notice no discernible change in their external circumstances. They evaluate the absence of discernible change as evidence that the practice is not producing results. And they either abandon it entirely, or they introduce modifications, adding more visualization content, adding emotional intensity, adding affirmations, in an attempt to make the practice feel more productive. Every one of these modifications moves the practice away from what makes it mechanically effective and toward what makes it feel satisfying but structurally inert. The modifications engage the conscious cognitive layer more fully. They make the practice feel more like something is happening, and they simultaneously make it less likely that what is happening reaches the subconscious prediction model with genuine update authority, because the increased conscious activity during the practice is itself a signal to the filtering systems that imagination is active and should be routed accordingly. The practice Neville was prescribing requires tolerating the experience of doing almost nothing and trusting that the almost nothing is reaching a place you cannot consciously access through any form of doing more. This tolerance is not natural. It runs against every instinct that productivity and achievement have trained into the modern mind. But it is precisely the tolerance that the practice demands. Because the subconscious prediction model is not accessible through doing. It is accessible through being, and being is by definition the absence of doing. Sleeping in the end is the practice of being the person who already is what you want to become in the specific neurological window when being something has more architectural authority than any amount of doing something ever can. The specific mechanics of what sleeping in the end requires at the physical level are less mystical and more neurologically concrete than most presentations of Neville's work suggest. What you are attempting to do in the hypnagogic state is not to construct a mental experience of being wealthy. You are attempting to allow the body itself to carry the physical characteristics of a person for whom wealth is the unremarkable biological baseline. This distinction between mental construction and physical inhabitation is the one that determines whether what you bring into the hypnagogic state passes through the withdrawn filtering systems as genuine identity data or gets held at the boundary and categorized as imagination, even in the absence of the full filtering apparatus. The body of a person who has always been wealthy carries specific default physical characteristics that are distinct from the body of a person who is working to acquire wealth. The most significant of these is the default tension level of the musculature. Financial anxiety generates chronic muscular tension as a background feature of the nervous system's ongoing threat monitoring. This tension is so pervasive and so continuous that people who have lived with financial anxiety for years stop noticing it as a distinct sensation. It becomes the baseline physical state against which everything else is measured. It is simply how the body feels. When you approach the hypnagogic state carrying this chronic tension, you are carrying the physical signature of financial threat monitoring into the state where the filtering systems are withdrawn. The subconscious receives that physical signature as genuine identity data, and the identity that physical signature represents is not the identity of someone for whom wealth is the permanent biological baseline. The preparation for the hypnagogic practice therefore begins before the practice itself. It begins with a deliberate physical release of the chronic tension that financial anxiety maintains as the body's background operating condition, not a psychological release, a physical one. The musculature of the jaw, the shoulders, the chest, the abdomen, and the hands carries the majority of the chronic financial stress tension in most people. Releasing this tension deliberately and physically before approaching the hypnagogic state changes the physical signature that the subconscious receives through the withdrawn filters. A body without chronic tension does not carry the biological markers of financial threat monitoring. It carries the physical signature of a system that does not experience financial threat as an ongoing feature of its environment. This is closer to the physical baseline of someone for whom wealth is simply the permanent condition of their existence than any amount of mental visualization of wealthy scenes can produce. The sequence Neville described, though rarely in these explicitly physical terms, involves 3 phases. The first is physical release, the deliberate relaxation of the chronic tension that financial anxiety maintains in the body. The second is identity settling, the allowing of consciousness to settle into the quality of a person for whom financial abundance is simply and boringly the case, without constructing mental images of that state, but allowing the physical release to create space for the identity to be felt rather than imagined. The third is release into sleep, the allowing of conscious direction to fade completely without attempting to maintain anything deliberately, trusting that what has been inhabited in the second phase will continue to register in the subconscious through the withdrawn filters as consciousness fades into sleep. The third phase is where most people's execution breaks down, because the tendency when approaching sleep with an intention is to try to maintain the intention as sleep approaches. This trying is the exact mechanism that signals imagination to the filtering systems, even as they are withdrawing. The trying is a conscious act. Conscious acts arrive through imagination channels. The moment you are trying to maintain the wealthy state in the hypnagogic state, you are signaling that the state requires maintenance, which signals that it is constructed rather than genuine, which triggers the filtering classification even as the filters are withdrawing. The correct execution of the third phase requires releasing the identity as completely as you release muscular tension in the first phase, not maintaining it, not carrying it deliberately into sleep, allowing the inhabitation of the second phase to have been sufficient, and releasing all deliberate direction entirely as sleep takes over. This releasing is not the abandonment of the practice, it is the completion of it. The second phase establishes the identity in the hypnagogic state with enough clarity and enough physical genuineness that the releasing of deliberate direction in the third phase does not erase what was established. It allows what was established to pass through the withdrawing filters without the contaminating signal of conscious maintenance. The subconscious receives the identity that was inhabited in the second phase as the last genuine data point before the conscious directing mind went fully offline, and it incorporates that data point into the prediction model with the update authority that the hypnagogic channel provides. The morning after a successful execution of this practice feels like nothing in particular. There is no confirmatory feeling that something shifted during the night. There is no sense that the practice worked. This absence of confirmatory feeling is not a sign that the practice failed. It is the signature of a process that operates below the threshold of conscious experience. The subconscious does not announce its architectural updates any more than the body announces the completion of cellular repair processes that occur during sleep. The process is entirely silent from the perspective of conscious experience. What accumulates over time is not a collection of memorable breakthrough moments, but a gradual and barely perceptible shift in the automatic relationship between the nervous system and financial information. Neville was explicit about the requirement of daily consistency with this practice in a way that he was not equally explicit about with other aspects of his teaching. He returned to it in lecture after lecture, not simply because he considered it important in theory, but because he had observed, through years of teaching and through the accounts of people who had successfully transformed their financial circumstances through his methods, that the hypnagogic practice was the single most reliable differentiator between people who achieved permanent transformation and people who remained in the cycle of temporary improvement followed by return to baseline. The people who practiced it every night without exception for extended periods consistently reported permanent shifts in their financial baseline. The people who practiced it occasionally or with inconsistent execution consistently reported temporary improvements that did not hold. The reason for this reliability is mechanically straightforward. Every night of consistent hypnagogic practice adds one data point to the pattern of identity data the subconscious is receiving through the maximum authority channel. Each individual data point produces no measurable effect. The accumulated pattern of data points, over 30 nights, 60 nights, 90 nights, begins to constitute a pattern that the subconscious prediction model cannot ignore without contradicting the preponderance of the identity data it has been receiving. The subconscious updates its predictions based on patterns. A single night of experiencing the wealthy identity in the hypnagogic state is not a pattern. 90 consecutive nights is a pattern, and a pattern received through the maximum authority channel has more architectural impact than years of visualization received through the imagination channels, regardless of how vivid or emotionally intense the visualization sessions were. This is what makes the simplicity of the practice deceptive to people who are accustomed to evaluating the value of a practice by its complexity or by the intensity of the experience it produces. Sleeping in the end is simple. It does not produce intense experiences. It does not generate the feeling of significant effort or significant progress. It does not provide the emotional satisfaction of doing something dramatic. It requires nothing more than a few minutes of physical release, followed by a brief period of quiet identity inhabitation, followed by complete release into sleep. And done consistently every night without modification and without abandonment when results are not immediately visible, it produces the kind of permanent neurological transformation that no amount of dramatic visualization practice has ever reliably produced. The people who have used this practice to permanently change their financial baseline share a common description of the moment they realized something fundamental had changed. They describe noticing, without intending to notice, that their automatic response to a financial situation that would previously have generated immediate and significant anxiety generated something closer to mild interest instead. Not positive thinking about the situation, not affirmations, not any deliberate effort to respond differently, simply a different automatic response, arriving without intention because the prediction model that generates automatic responses had been gradually and quietly rebuilt by 90 nights of identity data arriving through the channel that has the authority to rebuild it. That is the practice. One practice. Every night. No modification, no abandonment, no assessment of whether it is working based on how the individual sessions feel. The consistency is the entire practice. The consistency is what builds the pattern. The pattern is what reaches the prediction model, and the prediction model is what determines every automatic thought, every automatic emotion, every automatic behavior, and every automatic perceptual filter that shapes what opportunities you notice and what version of your financial future your nervous system considers to be the realistic expectation against which everything else is measured. Neville taught many things. This is the one practice he never stopped returning to, because it is the one practice that reaches the place where the actual determination of your financial life is made. Every other element of his teaching serves this one central practice by building the quality of identity you bring into the hypnagogic state. But the practice itself, the actual moment of architectural update, happens here, in the 60 seconds before sleep, every night. For as long as it takes for the pattern to become the new permanent architecture, and the new permanent architecture to become the new permanent life. If you are going to take one thing from this video and implement it tonight, this is the thing. Not a visualization exercise, not an affirmation. Lie down. Release the tension in your body deliberately and completely. Allow yourself to inhabit the quiet and unremarkable certainty of someone for whom financial abundance is simply the permanent case, and then let go. Release every deliberate direction. Allow sleep to take what you inhabited into the subconscious through the channel that has the authority to rebuild what every other channel has failed to reach. Do it again tomorrow night, and the night after that. The practice does not get more complex than this. The results do not arrive in a more dramatic form than a quiet shift in what your nervous system considers normal. But the quiet shift is the only shift that actually changes everything. Leave a comment with the word tonight if you are doing this practice tonight, because tonight is when it begins. There is one more aspect of this practice that deserves direct attention, because it is the aspect most likely to cause sincere practitioners to abandon it prematurely. Neville never described a sensation that clearly indicates the practice is working on any given night. He never described a feeling of connection, a feeling of breakthrough, a feeling of genuine contact with the subconscious that would serve as confirmation that the identity data is actually passing through the withdrawn filters with genuine update authority. This absence of confirmatory sensation is intentional. The practice does not produce confirmatory sensation because the process it initiates occurs entirely below the level of conscious experience. Expecting confirmatory sensation and interpreting its absence as evidence of failure is the most common reason people abandon the practice in the period immediately before it would have begun producing visible external results. The correct relationship with the practice is the relationship of someone planting seeds in ground they cannot see. The seeds are planted through a specific sequence of physical and mental action. Whether they germinate is not visible from the surface. The absence of visible germination in the days immediately after planting is not evidence that the seeds are not germinating. It is evidence that germination takes time and occurs below the surface where visible observation is not possible. The gardener does not dig up the seeds after a week to check whether they are growing. The gardener continues to plant, continues to water, continues to create the conditions in which germination can occur, and waits for the surface to show what has been happening underground. Your relationship with the hypnagogic practice requires exactly this quality of patient and unseeing consistency. The architectural update is happening below the surface. It will not be visible from the surface until it has accumulated sufficient depth to begin producing the changes in automatic behavior and automatic perception that eventually become visible as changed external circumstances. Plant the seed every night. Create the conditions every night. Trust the process that Neville observed working in himself and in everyone who implemented it with genuine and sustained consistency. And wait for the surface to show you what the underground has been quietly building all along.